Please welcome our speaker. As always with microphones, you know technology is always the weakest link in the chain, right? And remember Matt Blaze said that the weakest link in the chain of security is often the definition of the problem. And the definition of the problem is usually not what we think it is. The way it was described just now characterized the bad guys out there. It sounds like the Wild West. But the Wild West was stage one. Chicago was stage two. I grew up in Chicago, and in Chicago it's not just chaos, it's chaos well organized by corrupt forces and implemented in such a way that anyone must deal with them. As Mayor Daley the First said when he came into office, what are you going to do about the mob? He said, live with it. What would you do with it? Same with cybersecurity. It's riddled with opportunity to go into those spaces that enable miscreants, whether state, non-state, individual, or just crazies, to do stuff. So the theme, if there is one, is that things are not what they seem. We talk about these things as if it was one kind of world, and I'm sorry, I probably need some water. Rule 1, which I learned 20 years ago in speaking and forgot as I go into my dotage, is don't drink coffee just before you speak. Just do that. Drink a little bit of cold water. Is there cold water handy?
We're going to get some right now.
He's getting some. In the meantime, you're going to have to deal with an old man sounding raspy in a kind of rocking chair on his porch thinking of things to say. Okay, let's get into what we're saying. First of all, I want to say it's what a pleasure it is to be here. I'm a Midwesterner. I live in Milwaukee now. Milwaukee probably takes some of the same punches that Iowa takes because people don't know what's there. They have no idea what a solid place it is, how well educated it is, and what a great standard of living it is compared to my kid in San Francisco who just made his 23rd offer on a house that was outbid again by $100,000 over asking. We moved from Maui to Milwaukee. People don't understand that, but Midwest is paradise. And I could do a whole talk on that. And probably should one day when I no longer care what people in Hawaii think of me. Thank you. So, it's great to be here. And it's great to be at the first CornCon, which is long overdue, and a tribute to John and all the staff and people who've worked very, very, very hard to make this happen. This is the first of a tradition, as they say, at many first things. That's who I am. The information is always available. It's on the web at Thiemeworks. And the title of this talk is UFOs in Government, a Historical Inquiry. If there's a thread, it's this. Reality is that which, when you no longer believe in it, refuses to go away. As Philip K. Dick said presciently. When did this reality begin? This is a speech. We're going to do a little historical overview, very brief, to clarify that since World War II, when the OSS migrated through some rough patches into the CIA, and then the other intelligence agencies were stood up. We know the names of 16, but there are a lot more people doing organized and professional intelligence than that. But we know what we can see at any rate, and it began after World War II, when it was decided that the level of secrecy, the kinds of cover and deception necessary during World War II, read Churchill's books or the 2-volume book on deception the Brits did during World War II. It's just terrific. It establishes all the hallmarks of cover and deception that you need to do to cover your operations. Well, that was carried over into what we now call the national security state. It didn't get here by accident, it got here by choice. George Kennan, who was one of the people who formulated our policies in the 1940s, said in 1947, the communists have established a strong position in Europe. Through unabashed and skillful use of lies, they have fought us with unreality, with irrationalism. Can we combat unreality successfully with rationalism, truth, and honest, well-meant assistance? And the answer was no. We could not. The CIA appointed itself a Ministry of Culture when it realized we did not have a counterweight to the Soviet Ministry of Culture, and we had to do things in the realm of the arts, literature, journalism, and all sorts of covert operations that looked like media, looked like business. I was talking about a proprietary that looks like one thing and is done for another purpose, like the famous Project Azorian, Global Explorer, which has several levels of cover and deception, disguising the fact that what it was trying to do was get a Soviet submarine up, and the whole story about that has still not come out. But every level of cover and deception is appropriate to the knowledge and the framework which people have built at various levels of real access to compartmented knowledge. In other words, if you walked into a skiff and you were told what something was, what you would be told would be based on your level of clearance and your level of understanding, your framework. So that when I talk to some senior people at CIA, what has become clear to my chagrin, because it turns the Hall of Mirrors into a real wilderness, as it is characterized, is that when things are decided at the very top level, even people within the agencies do not know what is really true because they themselves are victimized by the spin or the cover story that must of necessity be seamless and maintained and sustained often for years. I had a friend at NSA say not long ago, he found out that a project on which he worked in the 1970s, 1980s, which everyone working on the project believed to be to a particular end, was in fact, while it was also to that end, which worked well at the cover story for those inside the agency working on it, was ultimately to another end entirely, which none of them knew for a couple of decades until the work was declassified. That's just trying to say that if you think you know what's going on, just like quantum physics, anyone who thinks they know what's going on doesn't know what's going on. It's a very confusing world, and as I say, it was confusing by design because paradoxically we, that is the United States, and I'm framing this within the American framework, paradoxically we created or manipulated all media in order to present the truths of the system to combat Soviet propaganda. And we did it on behalf of democracy, and the paradox, of course, is that it was covert. And therefore, doing it on behalf of democracy was simultaneously a paradoxical undermining of democracy itself. This is why, this is what we walk, a Mobius strip. We start off on one side as if we are going somewhere and it's a clear two-lane highway, and suddenly we don't even see the twists and bends that bring us back on the same side to the origin at the end of the trip. A Mobius strip is an appropriate figure, glyph, meme, metaphor for what life is like in the national security state. I'm going to take a quick side trip because he mentioned the books, so I got to throw these in a relevant way. This is a collection of short stories called Mind Games, and I started writing fiction again after I was working with people at NSA after 9/11 on serious ethical issues, which instructions from the White House seemed to require them to do things that had always been illegal and unconstitutional. What you do under those circumstances is just rewrite your understanding of legality and constitutionality, which is what we've done. But they were senior people who were very concerned because they'd always been told that what they did was this, and now the executive order 12333 and others said, do this. And they said, we can't do that, do this. So raised ethical issues, and as a former clergyman, which I was, don't let that distract you from the thread here. They thought I might have some insight into how we might reframe ethics itself in order to understand what was going on. And so, in the middle of that project, with some of these senior people, one of them said, you know, the only way you can tell the truth from now on, you can't talk about what we discussed. The only way you can do it is through fiction. So, for 35 short stories published, and I just had a new novel, Foam. What happened to that?
Right here.
Ah, he stood it up. Foam just came out 2 weeks ago. Wonderful book, fiction, maybe 2%. And the testimony to the nature of this book really came when someone tweeted a page from my first story, Zero Day Roswell. In the intro, a friend at NSA wrote, he said, this is hilarious. He said, 95% of the story is true, but you got to know which 95%. And people didn't know because they didn't have a point of reference until someone photographed a page allegedly from a dying intelligence agent saying this is what we do, and he just said boom, 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 all these things that we do that I could write in fiction. Somebody photographed that page, appended it to links that pointed to Snowden and said, look at this. Because there was Snowden, boom, 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 and there was my story, boom, 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 boom. But because I was smart enough to put it in fiction on the advice of Deputy Director of NSA, I can be here in Iowa, and Snowden has to look for Kishki in Moscow. There are ways to do this that work, but you have to read between the lines. So that's what Mind Games is. It's non-consensual realities, professional intelligence hackers, encounters with other civilizations, and that gets us to where we're going. There's a complicated weave. As E.B. White said, it's no wonder how complicated things get, but with one thing leading to another. And one of the ways we tried to sort it out was this book, UFOs in Government, a historical inquiry, which will be available either for examination, looking at it. You can download a whole PDF from the Internet Archive if you want to read a 600-page PDF on your desktop. That's fun. Or you can just buy the book, which is kept at a minimal price by the publisher because he wanted it out there. Is that going again?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was invited to participate with this extraordinary team. I won't go over all of them. I'll just say Robert Swords is a genius, professor of science at Western Michigan University. Robert Powell, head of the chemistry lab at AMD, the chip maker. Those are our two spearheads. And then there are three people down here, Barry Greenwood and Jan Aldrich, and Mike up there, who have been researching this stuff for 50 years. When I say researching for 50 years, I mean they're obsessive and compulsive. Do you know anyone interesting who's not obsessive and compulsive? Certainly not in this space, right? If you're merely mildly interested in security, get out. You know, do something where dabbling is appropriate to the level of sophistication you need to have. You have to be immersed, you have to be obsessive, you have to never put it down, you have to never sleep if you can use modafinil properly. You have to learn how to pursue the goal, the snark you are hunting, all the way to the very end of the hunt. And that characterized all these guys, so they spent all their spare time in archives and libraries using FOIA, becoming expert at using FOIA until it was ruined by Reagan and made irrelevant because you could never get what you wanted through FOIA for a variety of reasons, which I could discuss for an hour as well. A hell of a team, and I was lucky to be invited to participate in it, and over 5 years we wrote this book. It's a historical work. It's the only work of its kind, recommended for all university libraries because it's bulletproof. There's 1,000 footnotes, and they point to, every single one points to a primary document or a government document. So there is no footnote that you will follow to its original source that isn't bulletproof. And that's why it's in over 65 university libraries at the moment, including Yale, and the University of Basel, and the University of Chicago. It is recommended for all university libraries. You might tell your university that get on the ball. This is serious. This is a work of history, and the reviews are fantastic. It's a narrative of how the government responded. See, we couldn't say what the phenomena was for 60 years, except speculatively. That's the next book that we're working on now. We can say what the government did, because that's what we can document historically. And that's what this is about. This is about what the government did. We did this, come on, mostly in Mike's basement when we met. We met once, then for 5 years we went over the internet, then we went back to Mike's basement with a finished product. This is one wall of his basement. This is what it looks like to be an amateur, unfunded by the powers that be, the standard people who give grants and recognize with authority, therefore giving primacy to certain things like the snail darter, for example. Very important snail darter. UFOs, possibility of visitation, or non-standard realities intruding ultra-dimensionally in our own reality, not so much. Snail darters, yes. UFOs, no. So serious amateur researchers have to have places that look like this, and that's what Mike's basement looks like. Except there are walls and walls and walls of it. And we meet there, and we do research there. That's another wall. That's just to say that he really has accumulated quite a lot, has he not, over 50 years. And it's about UFOs. Now, you've heard a lot about UFOs. Everybody, if you're asked to draw a UFO, will. If you're asked to draw an alien, you will. It will have, I'm looking for an alien-shaped head. No, it's not fair, right? Big round head, but much bigger eyes, much bigger and much blacker, and a different communication style. So you could all draw the communion alien, you could all draw flying saucers, so it's not like we don't know about some kinds of flying saucers or humanoid presence on the planet. It's that these images have often been disseminated so successfully and sophisticatedly as part of the disinformation cover that I'm talking about. So what is a UFO now? Well, you'll find this in the paper. Space aliens drained my blood and filled my veins with the mysterious yellow fluid, says shaken steelworker. Okay, you would be shaken too if an entity that looked anything like this drained your blood and replaced it with a mysterious yellow fluid, or a mysterious fluid of any kind. This is in the National Enquirer. The National Enquirer is a major outlet through which images and stories about UFO phenomena have been disseminated for many decades. Very effective in terms of promulgating and framing your internal frame on what's real about this, which this statement makes that it's nonsense. The statement, the medium is the message. And so when you have the National Enquirer and you have something covered in it a lot, did they cover UFOs a lot? They did. Did UFOs sell a lot of papers? No, they did not. How do we know that? Because they had a cork bulletin board in the hallway of the National Enquirer. And every week they had the circulation figures and the 3 leading stories on the front page, and so they could graph metadata-like, in this primitive way, which stories worked best. And it was medical scandals, celebrity scandals, you know, the good stuff, the Kardashian-style stuff. UFOs were down, and yet what instance occurred more than any other single kind of story, UFO stories? Why would someone dedicated to making money do something that didn't work as well as other things and do that other thing less? Was there another agenda? I don't know. Let me just suggest some facts that you want to take into account when you're looking at things like the tabloids. You've seen Men in Black, right? Remember when he threw the tabloids down on the table and he said, forget the New York Times, this is where you get the truth. Where did the National Enquirer come from? American History, 101. Who started it? What's his name? What year did it start? You see? You see? Just take it in. It started in 1953. There's a reason that's a significant year, which I'll get to in a minute. It was started by a guy named Gene Pope, Generoso Pope. He wanted to start this tabloid and make money. I guess he wasn't enjoying his work in 1952. What was he doing in 1952? According to his own resume, he was doing psychological operations for the CIA. And he decided to quit that job and start a paper like this. Did it make money? Not so much. Did it lose money? Yes, for years, until the 60s. How did it stay in business? Because hundreds of thousands of dollars every year came into his hands through Frank Costello, the chief of the Mafia family in New York City, who was also linked through the whole Kennedy thing to blah, 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 blah. We won't go into that one. It's just that that's how he sustained his newspaper with hundreds of thousands of dollars given to him in grocery sacks by Frank Costello when it wasn't making any money. And he ran a lot of UFO stories. When he died, who did the eulogy at his funeral? You expect a ne'er-do-well like this, a bad guy, to have some schlub, but it was Melvin Laird, Secretary of Defense, did the eulogy at his funeral. These are just all interesting facts. So when Terry Hansen, a journalist in Oregon, decided to write the Missing Times, it was because in the 1970s someone called him from Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana and said, can you believe what's going on out here? And he said, what's going on? He said, there's sightings, there's events, there even included interference with codes on nuclear missiles for several days, and it's covered by all the local media. And Terry said, why didn't it ever migrate to the top media? Why was this never covered seriously? And so we investigated that. He found out the only story on Malmstrom appeared 4 years later in the National Enquirer when it wouldn't go away, and then of course that killed the story. This is standard operating procedure for the CIA. Standard, not unusual. When John Kenneth Galbraith was an ambassador to India, he found a rag that was worse than this, and he demanded his staff find out what kind of bastards put it out. And he found out it was a CIA covert operation. So there's good stuff. They published over 1,000 books anonymously in the 50s and 60s, made movies like Animal Farm covertly, undertook all sorts of proprietary operations which were covertly executed and very effectively disguised, because they understood that to be their job. And that coincided with the onrush of UFO phenomena. There was other news going on. This is what a UFO could look like. I mean, not one of those alien things. This was taken by a Coast Guard operator out his window in Salem, Massachusetts in 1952. If I have time, I'll tell you why they glow white like that, what kind of ionization of the nitrogen in the atmosphere around is taking place, and why the colors change in direct proportion to the intensity of the power source which is generating the movement of the object. It is not flying. We think of flying as blowing gas out of your ass and going forward inversely in proportion to the force of the gas. That's flying. This is not flying. There are no wings. This is something that disturbs the electromagnetic field, the gravity field. Space-time distortion around it is always present, and the way it moves, and the way it disappears, and the way it changes shape, which is something we're approaching now with shape-changing materials, signifies that this is not simply your normal airplane flying in air, because it doesn't require air. It requires a source against which to push in order to ignite the propulsion system, which we have tried and so far failed to duplicate. But that's just an aside. That's what it looks like. You don't have to believe any of this. Just hold this agnostically as I get to the other stuff. This was a picture a farmer took in Oregon. It's been promulgated. He took two, and it was in Life magazine. I won't say any more about it other than Paul Trent took the pictures, and the guy who buried him, mortuary guy who I went and met in McMinnville, Oregon, swore that Paul said to the day he died, he took those pictures. He didn't know enough to doctor them, being a farmer out in the country. No slur to farmers out in the country, here in Iowa. But he didn't know how cameras worked well enough. We didn't have Photoshop. Today, no photos or videos are legitimate on the surface without thorough analysis of a kind that ordinary people cannot do in terms of accuracy. So he wished, he said, he'd never publish those. Was the FBI interested in UFO reports? Yes. Were all filed reports released? No. What other reports are there? Well, that's our job. That was the homework we had to do in order to get this book in shape. Where did all the interest in UFOs begin? It began in the 40s. You're looking at pictures of what look like globules of light. They're taken from planes over Germany. These were called Foo Fighters. They called them Foo Fighters because foo was the French word for fire, F-E-U. I can't pronounce French, so I say foo, and I'm sure a French speaker would say you fool. But it's a Foo Fighter, firefighter. They look like fire. They're red, usually red and white, glowed, paced airplanes, and when they were done doing whatever it was that they were doing, behaved a lot like we would think trailers or drones or intelligence gathering objects do, because that's what ours do. Then when it was done, it went up very fast or took off very fast. They didn't seem to damage anything, and we didn't know what they were. They appeared over the Japanese and European theaters. The military said they were curious in the fact of it, but they didn't care really what they were. Our research, which you'll see in the first chapter of the book, says, well, not quite, because we've gotten enough documents to show that they were highly concerned at the highest levels, because we thought they were secret weapons developed by the Japanese and or Germans, except that they never did anything that we could determine. And after the war, when we got the treasure troves of information that we captured from the Japanese and Germans, we discovered that they too were mysteriously baffled by these things, hadn't created them, didn't know what they were either. So that's when the, quote, modern era begins, because we're flying up there. Now we're seeing things. Now this wasn't the first time things were seen. 1926, biplane brainstorming in a fair in the Midwest came down, and he said, I saw two things fly up next to me that looked like manhole covers. Because we didn't have the word flying saucer until 1947, when it was coined by the newspaper incorrectly, extracting from Kenneth Arnold's report. They skipped through the air, he said, like saucers in 1947 in Washington. And they said they looked like saucers. He said they looked like heels, rounded front, square back. They're different kinds of things, different kinds of objects. And so we wanted to know what was going on. Well, that increased. These are the kinds of documents which you will find in full in our book. It is our opinion the phenomenon is real, not visionary or fictitious. I put this down right at the start, 1947, just to make the case that those powers that be and the authoritative voice had not yet been tamed. That'll come in 6 years. It's real. It's not made up, it's not imagined. They're the shape of a disc, and then characteristics reported by good observers, pilots and radar operators on the ground and ground observers of other kinds, extreme rates of climb, incredible maneuverability, an action that would be considered evasive. In other words, when we chase them, they go away. Intelligent responses to probes, whether in action or in signals. What do they look like? They're metal, they're circular or elliptical, flat bottom, domed on top, formations 3 to 9, no associated sound. They don't make sound. You don't hear a motor humming away as it does. Sometimes a low hum, but that's a different question, and we can do science on that in a different way. Later, even 20 years later, Congressman Johnson was getting so many inquiries in Texas, he wanted to know what it was, and he appointed a private group, and it included Kelly Johnson, who was the head of Skunk Works, and Art Lundell, the National Photographic Center, and in their private report to Johnson, they said, yes, the UFO phenomena is in all likelihood advanced technology created off our planet. You taught this in American history? I don't think. This is an alternative history, well documented. The answer to which, when people say, how did government respond to your book? And I just stand there for a while until people get the joke. The authoritative voice can either debunk, ridicule, or spread disinformation, or be silent. In our case, ignore the book, let people pass it around, let people say what they want, and then flood the information space with alternative interpretations of other kinds, or let Paris Hilton get out of jail free, and then that'll go on the front page headline, and our work will go back to 23 into the silly season pages, the green sheet we call it, Milwaukee. But it was real, and they knew it was real. So the Air Force had to respond, because so many were being reported after Kenneth Arnold. And there were 3 hypotheses, according to Project Sign, which was formulated in 1948. Are they our technology? Because, as I said, we can successfully disguise and hide all kinds of technology and still do it very effectively. Things aren't usually known out here for 10, 20, sometimes 30 years. At a CIA tell me a technology he worked on in the 70s is just becoming known. So you got a time lag where you have to do the timeline corroboration with who makes stuff and how do they make it and how does it show up and how is it used, and that's work. And a lot of people don't want to do that work. But was it American? The conclusion was no. We could not do what they could do. As Edgar Mitchell said to me much later, the Apollo 14 astronaut who walked on the moon, and he said to me, and you remember his voice as he said it, Richard, he said, if we could do what they can do, they would not have sent me to the moon in a tin Lizzie, is what he said. Sitting there 3 days, spam in a can, coming back powerless in a box, as opposed to 0 to 10,000. I wish we could do it, he said. So they had to decide what to do with this. Was it Russian? Because if the Russians could overfly our installations at will, this was a serious thing. 52, 53, 40s, Cold War cranking up. We knew who the next enemy was going to be. We're hunkering down and trying to strategize for that. But we determined that the Russians could not do it either. They did not get, nor will any of the nonsense on the web convince you, or should convince you, that they did get Nazi secret discs. We know about the brothers. We know about what the Nazis were working on. We have troves of documents. The Nazis did not create these things. They're not hiding in Bolivia or somewhere flying over our skies. The Russians didn't have them either. And the third hypothesis was the only one that fit the data. They're extraterrestrial. Now, in those days, extraterrestrial was the only frame that could be used to make sense of what was going on, because we didn't have ultra-dimensional, we didn't have hyper-dimensional, we didn't have space-time distortion, we didn't have fifth dimensional realities, we didn't have 11, 12 string theory dimensional realities. We couldn't, in other words, begin to conceive of a universe which, whatever it was that we didn't know, was so much more mysterious than extraterrestrial, that is, going from point A to point B. So that's what they said. They concluded it was extraterrestrial because nothing else fit the data. The brass at the top knocked it down and said, I refuse to accept that. End of story. If you're in the Air Force and the brass at the top says this doesn't exist, then all the way down to the lowest officer it doesn't exist. So they formulated this template. We have investigated and evaluated fill in the blank and have found nothing of value to change our previous estimates on the subject. This blank was disseminated and to be used in case of any reported sightings to the Air Force. Just fill it in. The name of the place, the time of the place, the idiot who reported it, why they were probably drunk or crazy or whatever, which successful ridicule eventually shut down people wanting to tell what was going on. Some didn't like this. General Charles Cabell said, what do I have to do? We haven't got an answer to the problem. And then 1952, all hell broke loose. Orders to fire on a mirage or hallucination, which is what it was described as. No, this is one of our documents. At a distance of 130 miles to the northwest east of Washington, 3 different radar units detected an object 18,000 feet. Strong signal, stationary for half an hour, began to move. By the time it reached the edge of the scope, it was traveling over 1,000 miles an hour. We couldn't do that in 1952. Our report went to the Pentagon. The order came back that if another one came in, not that you were to laugh and have a champagne glass because you saw a hallucination, the order came in, fire on it. And so we loaded our 99mm anti-aircraft guns, which was unusual in a populated area, right over Washington, Virginia. Maryland, and we scrambled F-94 jet fighters from McGuire Air Force Base, which didn't have much luck in pursuit. In other words, they knew there was intrusion, they knew it was real, they knew it was bigger and stronger in terms of its power and capacity than ours, and they guessed it was coming from somewhere else that we couldn't understand. It was 1952. Then the big one, July 1952, over 2 weekends, over Washington, D.C., ground Air Force radar picked it up, National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base picked it up, ground observers saw them, F-94s were scrambled, pilot radar on the aircraft got them, pilots saw them with their eyes, and Major General John Samford, making the mistake of speaking the simple truth, said credible people have seen incredible things. And the point I want to make in light of the National Enquirer thing I just showed you is that this is what it looked like then. It was news. It was news. The medium is the message, and this is the headline in the Washington Post on July 28th, 1952. Saucer outran jet, pilot reveals. It doesn't say crazy hallucination reported by pilot. Crazy drunk pilot thinks he sees something that isn't there. It says the saucer outran the jet. And so they're investigating in secret. Now, the Washington Post is an authoritative voice. They would never print that headline today because the media has been so successfully manipulated and co-opted both in order not to do that, to be with the program. But other media did the same. Here's the Alexandria Gazette. Let's see, the next one is, I think, Miami. Yeah, spots 8 saucers flying. Notice these are headlines on the front page. The newspapers all over the country, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these articles. We're full of these. This is Indianapolis, 100 flying saucers. This is England. Just to make it clear, as using one example among many, that this was happening in over 150 countries globally. And as a friend at NSA said to me, when something happens over all the countries in the world, and when it persists in the small details over 50 years, and it may be funny in one culture, but it's not funny in others, then you have to report the details as accurate. The details are pointing to a genuine phenomena that deserves scientific investigation. That's all we're claiming. Most conservative, right? Details, data, suggest something's real, investigate it. Snail darter, minimal entry level criteria, because it's scaring the hell out of people, right? What is it? Well, that's what it looked like on the radar when that was happening. You see the one in the middle, that's our guy. You see those 6 around it, that's them. And he was supposedly in pursuit. But then that which he was pursuing formed a circle and began slowly closing in on him. You can imagine how he felt. If 6 of us got up and closed in on our hapless example here, he would start to become a fight or flight. He did, but he couldn't fight because they were so surrounding and powerful. And he couldn't fight because he didn't have the armaments, because it wouldn't work. It didn't work. We tried. It didn't work. And they came in very close, and we have the transcript of his reports, which I cannot report because there are many, many obscenities in that transcript. As he's saying, holy, a lot of bleeps, a lot of bleeps. And then the 6 around him went scattered. Point made, right? You want to chase us? Oh, okay, let's play. You want to play a game, Professor Fulton? We can play the game, but we can't win. Not in 1952. So, remember, this is a historical event. So the CIA got involved, and this was their conclusion. The CIA and Air Force had a panel called the Robinson Panel in '53. Flying saucers are not a threat to national security. Why? They're not firing on anybody. As far as anybody knows, they're not capturing and doing anal probes on anybody. But reports of flying saucers are a threat. Why? Because during that flap I just showed you, so many calls came into the Pentagon switchboard in Washington that it shut down, because so many people saw it. And that was an alarm, because the Soviets were cranking up as a credible threat that could manipulate and use social events in order to cover genuine attacks or other manipulation and propaganda style of the American public for their own purposes. And therefore what we had to do was 2 things, they concluded. 1, have trained observers learn everything we can about this technology so we can understand and make use of it covertly, overtly, debunk flying saucers. A friend of mine who does cover and deception at NSA says there's 3 legs to that stool. Illusion, create things that people think are real. Sleight of hand, when there is something real like here. Look over here, thank you. Eyes move, good. Kardashians. There is a correlation between ridiculous stuff in papers and getting people's attention off important things. A friend of mine at NSA has done that. Signing up. So, illusion, misdirection, and the most powerful of all, ridicule. Ridicule. What the hell does Richard know? Yeah, he can speak to 80 people in some cornfield, like CornCon, but what's his credentials? What's his government standing? What's his clearances? He doesn't know anything. And besides, look at this. In 1972, he did this. We have his ex-wife on testimony for that. Here's the video. Easy to ridicule. Start slow, go deeper. Easy to, I know lawyers who go to seminars. Jerry Spence has them at his ranch on trial lawyering. And it's all, the whole seminar is on ridicule. Most effective when the timing is just right, because ridicule destroys the credibility of the witness for a jury while not even touching the testimony and factuality of what he is saying. And that's what's been done so effectively here. Lots of stories about that. So that's what they decided. Now that wasn't determinative of how all government policy followed. It's not that simple. But that's the way they were thinking, and that was the recommendation. And that pretty much came out. So we have a much longer document appended to that that shows their attempt. They said we need to get the media people, Arthur Godfrey, Dave Garroway, Walter Cronkite did a good thing on their behalf on UFOs, showing this is what it looks like, oh, this is what it really was. In other words, very effective over time, embedding in the American mind of society that these things are silly, not worthy of attention, and only kooks, conspiracy theorists, and drunks are going to report them. Very effective. And they have different rules than we do. They do inside of professional intelligence. I know that. You know that. An open hearing on intelligence matters is a contradiction in terms. You can't have them, because when you're inside, you don't see yourself as lying. You see yourself as maintaining cover and keeping the story clear and clean and seamless. That's not lying. That's doing your job. So what looks to a normal, ordinary human, like some in this room, like a lie, inside it becomes what Clapper said before Congress: I said the least untruthful thing I could say. And that is the characteristic of how you talk about issues like these, items like these. Illusion, misdirection, ridicule I have touched on. To make sure you know we're not the only ones looking at this. This is from the head of NASA, the equivalent of NASA, CNES in France. Campaigns of misinformation try to destabilize, even ridicule those who treat it seriously. The American effort is deliberate and orchestrated disinformation. But to what purpose? Loss of supremacy? Keeping potential acquired technology? Some other purpose? We do not know. And then people like Hillenkotter, one of the first heads of the CIA, said, it's time for the truth to be brought out. Again, this is back in 1960, after he was head of the CIA in the 50s, when this was taking place. Through official secrecy and ridicule, citizens are led to believe the unknown flying saucers are nonsense. How many times do you have to show you guys, that is you guys, the aggregate, documented information, inside quotes, which are bulletproof, which shows what they said and did? How many times do we have to do that before it finally nudges the very effective mind of society deception framework that has been built over the years out of place enough for people to say, as you're going to hear in other things today, the government lies. The Air Force lies. The government is supposed to lie. When Obama was ridiculing Trump for firing Meatloaf, he was killing Osama bin Laden. He couldn't get up and say, you know, Trump is firing Meatloaf, I'm killing Osama bin Laden, I hope. Had to lie. You have to lie when you do this work. Insecurity and professional intelligence, unfortunately that means that the lower echelons of people doing this work will lie a little more and more to their own self-advantage and self-interest exclusively, and not on behalf of what they frame, whether rightly or not, the best interest of the country. So, these are the kind of stories you're going to see. Hooker gives birth to triplets, one black, one white, one Chinese, which is effectively linked, we know how the brain works, by association, UFO aliens found at South Pole. Therefore, anyone who might suggest aliens are at South Pole or anywhere is lying, because that other stuff is nonsense. Very effective. That's appearing at the same time that these stories are still being written. Here's Navy guys at Millington Air Force Base drawing the rough diagram of the saucer they saw All four saw it. The radar backed up statement says their name, story on page 1. This was news disseminated to the American people to try to say this is what is being reported, but in the face of this other stuff. The simple fact is the sheer muchness of it means you just can't win. I'm going to have to, I'm looking at the clock, and I do want to keep on track here. Hynek started CUFOS. Hynek was the astronomer hired by Project Blue Book. Dude, many talks in it, but all I'm going to say is Project Blue Book was a public relations campaign, and the major cases did not go to Project Blue Book, they went somewhere else. Hynek was hired and did his best to wiggle a relationship that would be maintained by the Air Force. He was attacked for not being rigorous and hard-nosed, but he knew they'd fire him because he had no leverage to stay. And he wanted to stay because he wanted to know what was going on. On his deathbed, he even said, "Why won't they tell me what is going on?" He had cancer by then. And that was one of his last statements. "Why won't they tell me? Why won't they tell me?" And he said this factually before then: the public is placed in the role of the enemy against whom counter-espionage tactics are employed. This is the point of what the national security state has become. It's just a shame, isn't it? That we live in this wilderness of mirrors, and in order to find out the truth about our own affairs in our own country, we have to be counterintelligence experts who have the time and the effort and the willingness to work in collaboratory environments to kind of deconstruct the very effective streams of information dominance. And even then, it's not going to work. You're going to hear about ISIS. The Russians are doing incredibly successful work in information dominance right now in the countries on the edges of their sphere of influence, in Sweden, Latvia, and so on. It's really good. The whole detailed thing, I hope you'll hear more about that later. But NATO has a team whose job is to read and monitor Russian propaganda in order to understand what it is the Russians are doing. And they discovered they had to come up with a second team to debrief the first team. Because even though the first team knows what it's reading as propaganda, and it is reading it in order to determine and outline the propaganda themes that are being promulgated, the brain can't help absorbing a lot of it as it is read. Like when you see a movie, you mistake it for reality. Virtual reality is coming. It's going to raise that to the square, put on your Oculus Rift. We all have a shared space with avatar presence to each other, and just watch what's coming down the line, probably next week, next month, soon. And so the bottom line is they had to debrief the people who were reading the propaganda, even though they knew they were reading propaganda, because they couldn't help coming to believe some of it. We who are in this saturated information space, so effectively manipulated and monitored by a whole collusion of people for all sorts of interests. It's not a conspiracy, it's a coming together of mutual self-interest in a variety of ways. If I see one more news program, do a close-up on a crying woman's face in order to end the interview. That's all they want is crying woman or blood. The media was complicit in 9/11. More complicit even, maybe, than the attackers. Because by showing the images again and again and again, people knew what had happened. You showed it once, it happened. Or you described it in words, which kept it removed. No, again and again and again, the secondary trauma that resulted in the American population at that time, the fear and binary way of thinking about good and evil that resulted directly came from being assaulted by those images again and again and again. And that was the media, with its own monetary self-interest, promulgating something horrible for its own sake and its own self. This is just what we swim in. So, when we're dealing with UFOs, well, I got to wrap it up. So, let me see. Hynek said that. It took Hynek many years to realize he was an enemy because he wanted to find the truth, and that was contrary to national security concerns, as I said. But he still said the UFO phenomenon is characterized by the constant flow of reports from 150 countries that come from highly responsible people. Either it's happening or they're all liars, and you can't keep saying they're all hallucinating. That's the bottom line. They're not. You can do science on it too. Boy, I can't do it because there's just too much to cover in this 1 hour. I'm just going to say that this is Dr. Hermann Oberth doing a lecture in German, which we translated in 1954. He was Werner von Braun's mentor in German rocketry. And he's saying the appearance, he describes the appearance, how they look, how they fly, how they tip, the brightening, dark orange and cherry at night, not much power, They also don't shine much. If they need more power, shining increases. As I said, they appear yellow, yellow-green, green like a copper flame, and when they're going fastest, they're extremely white. So white, I've had witnesses say, I've never seen a white like that. White, white, white. And then he adds, I would doubt the accuracy of these if I only had 3 or 4, but I have seen over 50 from radar sets in airplanes of the American Air Force and Navy, used in all fighters. They can't all be wrong. This is 1954, and he's giving a lecture, and I'm saying this too is, of course, not included in your history lessons in school. He's saying he's got good data from good, responsible witnesses and observers, and it's documented, and this is what we see, and it's consistent with the way the power and the physics of the entity operates. And Paul Hill, who was at NASA for many, many years, told by NASA you cannot identify with NASA, but you can do what you want as a private citizen, wrote a book called Unconventional Flying Objects, published by his daughter after his death. And he illuminates that. The same colors that Oprah said. Why? Because the strong radiation peaks of nitrogen, you're seeing ionization around the craft, and you're not seeing the craft itself. It's, the power structure is ionizing as it intensifies the nitrogen in the air around it, and it glows according to these colors, which are easily documented by our physics, our primitive Earth-like physics, so that we can understand kind of what is happening. So, there are lots of events. I'm not going to go over them. I'm just going to say they didn't stop. The debunking didn't stop. There is, in my understanding, there is currently a conversation, don't call it a battle, conversation inside among those who know at the most deepest compartmented access levels of whether to say what we know or not say what we know. And these conversations are distorted by religion, because people who confront powerful, trauma-inducing entities or phenomena often trigger a spiritual or religious reaction, which calls forth, according to Carl Jung, an outpouring from your own soul of images and archetypes which cover the phenomenon itself with what you believe its meaning to be. And that's all going on right now. We don't know where they are from. We don't really know when they are from, which is probably the more important question. We don't know what it is or how it works, not because we haven't tried, as I have said, since the 50s, to reverse engineer. We've done some. We have fiber optics. We have high-powered energy-to-particle beam weapons. We have lasers. We have enhanced communications of a kind that the ordinary person cannot even begin to comprehend. And some of that came from observing what was being done. But we don't know how to build the console. We don't know how to make it go. We don't know how to create all those alloys, or how they're used in relationship to the being, which seems to be an integral part of the ship itself, as we are learning to become, as we integrate ourselves telepathically and through beanies, creativity hats. I did a whole talk on biohacking and biotech at DEF CON, where I spoke for the 20th straight year last August, on what's coming, using as best I could what I could glean from within the research and development of, it's all, all going to be on YouTube. So this is serious stuff. I'll return to where I started. Credible people have seen incredible things. These are real photographs. That's what they look like, sometimes, from some points of view. In other words, those are real objects flying before we could do something like that. This one was taken from a film made at Hills Air Force Base. Bottom line, UFOs and government. It's recommended for all university libraries. Why? Because we've written the best book on the subject. Nearly 1,000 citations and almost 600 pages. Illuminates the history of the government's response. Minimal speculation about aliens and origins. We don't go where we don't know. But we do think, if you see the nose of the camel inside the tent, do you think that there might be a camel? Follow the breadcrumbs before the birds eat them all, and the birds eat them all very quickly. Just quickly, as I conclude, because I got to make a pitch. This book just came out. It's called Foam. It's big because it's so packed with essential, wonderful stuff. It's literary work. I mean, if you like Neil Stephenson, if you like reading 1,000-page Bhagavad Gita, you'll love this book. But it's really good. It's got hackers in it, Don Quixote and Pancho Sanchez, who are trying to fight the battle of righteousness in cyberspace. And what happens to them is what happens to everybody who tries to do that. It's got corrupt bankers, who are easy pickings, right? because the industry is riddled with it. That's a whole other talk I did at Black Hat. The dark side of professional security and intelligence got the biggest response I've ever had. But this guy in the front is Jack Tufel. He's an alien who's compressed into human form. Why? Because we are the funniest and the sexiest species in the galaxies. They have found nothing funnier, so they want to send someone who looks human enough to interact with us and do improv. So he can radiate telepathically his exchanges with human beings, because we're so funny. And in order to prepare for his mission, he studies cable TV and the internet. So he gets a slightly distorted view of human behavior. Too much Sex in the City, too much girls, too much Grey's Anatomy. He thinks it only takes 10 minutes, man or woman, gay or straight, before you're getting it on with someone. Because that's what he learned, so he thinks that's what we do on Earth. Well, 98% of the time he's right, but not always. So his journey to transformation at the hands of Heidi the heroine and the other wonderful characters, it's all about trance, it's all about consciousness, it's all about the scheme from which he comes, the pan-galactic sentient web of intelligence. The galaxies formed years and eons ago, long before we were even glints in Australopithecine. It's a great, great book. It'll be discovered when I'm dead. My children will benefit. Okay, I'm around. I will be here. We do have book signing. They're always available. I'm not supposed to call my beloved wife a booth bunny, so I will not. But my beloved non-booth bunny wife is like a booth bunny, available at the books back there through the day. She does not dress like a book bunny or act like a booth bunny, but she's a good booth bunny. At any rate, thank you, darling, for manning the book station. And I'll be around Q&A. This raises all kinds of questions. Take a look at the book. If you don't want to buy it, that's fine. But take a look at it and see what we did. I know in Wisconsin, all the libraries have it, not so much in Iowa. You need someone across the state line to sell it. Anyone want to volunteer for that? See me after the talk. Q&A all day. Thank you very, very much for your intelligence and attentiveness. It's no joke. It's entertaining, but it's no joke. And it's a game changer. Because we are not who we think we are. We do not come from where we thought we came. And the organizational structures of our myths and realities are subject to change. Some people can't think that without coming undone. But you guys are smarter than that. You can think it. So I encourage you to think it, and if you have any questions, please ask me. Thank you very, very much.